I mean, Ismay's father was Thomas Ismay, who was your classic bootstrapping, hard-knuckle businessman. He basically bought the bankrupt White Star Line in the 1860s for nothing, for £1,000, and he partnered with a gentleman named Gustav Christian Schwabe, who was actually a converted Jew from Hamburg. And they partnered together to both build the White Star Line and the Harlan Wolff shipping line. So this was a symbiotic business. So, and also Schwab's nephew was named Wolff, and that was the Wolff of Harlan and Wolff. So actually, Harlan and Wolff actually has a German-Jewish connection, as does the White Star Line. But Ismay built this company from the ground up, and he introduced great luxury in first class. But his ships were also big steerage carriers. I mean, he was absolutely a ruthless man. I think he was very tough on his son, Bruce.
Titanic Talk with Nelson Aspin and Alexandra Boyd. Here we feature stories from the independent documentary Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, and everything to do with the iconic ship. From James Cameron's epic, groundbreaking movie to the history and legacy of Titanic herself. Actors, historians, authors, descendants and fans come here to talk about Titanic. This is your first-class ticket to everything aboard the Ship of Dreams.
This is Nelson Aspin with Alexandra Boyd for Titanic Talk. But before we go to our regularly scheduled podcast today, we did want to acknowledge the passing of Jon Landau. We wouldn't have Titanic Talk if it weren't for the 1997 version of Titanic. That wouldn't have, if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't have had Alexandra's wonderful documentary Ship of Dreams, which led to Titanic Talk and the wonderful community of friends that we have as a result of that. So we wanted to take a moment and honor him. And Alexandra, having worked with him on said Titanic, what are your fondest recollections?
Well, he was a giant in the industry. There's no doubt about that. Not only is his legacy Titanic, but the Avatar movies as well, and his collaboration and his professional relationship with James Cameron for 31 years was outstanding. And I think he's probably an example of doing few things really well rather than scattergunning movies across our screens for as long as he was working. But he always stood out on set because he had very colorful jumpers, sweaters, as the Americans would say, like Missoni, like I think they were Missoni jumpers. So you could always spot John in the crowd, and he was just always charming and jolly, and I think just genuinely loved being there. As if you imagine some of the stresses and the money that was evaporating in front of him as the producer, he still had the most congenial outlook. And then the day after they all won all the Oscars, 11 Oscars, I had John's telephone number, and on my landline, we love to talk about our landlines pre-mobile, I called and left a message on the voicemail to say, congratulations, and how terribly proud I was to have been even a tiny part of the film, and how exciting it was. We had a bunch of the actors over to my house to watch the telecast, and it was really exciting. So I just left a congratulations voicemail, and he called me back to thank me for my voicemail. Who does that when you've just won 11 Oscars? He must have been on the phone for 2 days thanking people for congratulating him. Yeah.
Well, and we knew he was a fan of Ship of Dreams as well.
He did get to see it. Yes, he
is still part of, and forever will be part of, our Titanic Talk community. And what I loved in one of the obituaries I read is that he said he believed that film was the ultimate human art form. And that just goes to show you that he had a passion for what he did. We all have a passion for what we do, and if we don't, you should. So let that be his legacy.
Well, rest in peace, John.
Amen. I'm Nelson Aspen, and I'm so excited to be back with another episode of Titanic Talk. I'm so excited I can't talk, but at least there's Titanic Talk to talk about. I did not go to Harvard University, but I married into a family. I married someone who did go to Harvard University, and one of the perks of that marriage is getting a membership to the Harvard Club. They have very distinguished and esteemed speakers there, in addition to great wine and pretty good steak. So I wanted to attend this gentleman's speaking engagement, wasn't able, but better, I got him as a guest on Titanic Talk. I'd like you to meet Stephen Ujifusa, who has written one of the best books I've read this year, The Last Ships from Hamburg, Business, Rivalry, and the Race to Save Russia's Jews on the Eve of World War I. Welcome to Titanic Talk, Stephen.
Nelson and Alexandra, thank you so much for having me.
The book is extraordinary, and I will say, as it tells the story of Eastern European Jewish immigration to America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the second Exodus. Publishers Weekly rightfully called it one of the best books of the year. I agree. And there is a very big Titanic connection. In fact, there is a chapter called The Martyrs of the Titanic. So let's just start with what your initial interest, how were you piqued in your interest of steamships and notably Titanic?
Well, this book was sort of a coming home for me as an historian. My grandmother told me the story of the Titanic when I was around 6 years old, and she grew up in Brooklyn. She was the daughter of Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire. And she highlighted the story of Isador and Ida Straus. And my grandma was born in 1916, 4 years after the Titanic went down. But apparently the story of the Strauses, how this German-Jewish couple who were immigrants themselves to America had made it in the New World. He was the co-owner of Macy's department store. How he and his wife didn't part when she could have gotten in a lifeboat and left. How they didn't part. And when she famously said, "We've been living together for many years, where you go, I go, so we live, so we will die together." That story resonated throughout the Jewish community, not just in New York, but through the world, of how this couple stayed together in the face of death. So that's how I got interested in history, in shipping, and writing this book, The Last Ships from Hamburg, was an examination of where my own mother's family came from, why they came to this country. And they were fleeing pogroms, persecution, military conscription, at a vicious level in the Russian Empire. But also, this book was revisiting a figure I've written about earlier, who is famous to many steamship lovers, Albert Ballin, who was the managing director of the Hamburg America line, and a German Jew himself, who arguably brought more immigrants to this country than any other single person.
And you also say he was now sort of known as the father of modern cruise ship travel. So I mean, we're still living off of some of Ballin's work and dreams and missions and things like that. But Alexandra and I have talked about this before, how such a monumental tragedy as the Titanic spawned so many positive things. Your love for history that has turned you, into the scholar you are, born out of a story your grandmother told you. We should also point out that the Strauses weren't the only first-class Jews on board. Tell us the story of the notable story that was depicted in James Cameron's film as well.
Benjamin Guggenheim was heir to one of the great mining fortunes in this country. His father was a Swiss Jewish immigrant, and he was known as the least motivated of Meyer Guggenheim's children. He was traveling home with his mistress. His wife, Florette Seligman, Guggenheim was still in New York with their daughter, Peggy, who later became known as a great art collector. And Benjamin Guggenheim sent off his mistress, Leontine Aubert, got into a lifeboat. But then the steward famously urged Benjamin Guggenheim to put on a life belt, and he refused. And instead, he and his valet, Victor Gilliot, dressed in their evening dress, white tie and tails. And Benjamin Guggenheim said, "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." And that became a famous story, too, of him upholding what was seen as a gentleman's code. And I will say that Walter Lord, the great American author, who in many ways gave birth to American narrative popular history. I mean, David McCullough described Walter Lord as his great inspiration and mentor for the writing of A Night to Remember. Walter Lord said, essentially, I expected when I began researching the story that the rich people behaved poorly and the poor people behaved wonderfully, and that was the story. And he said, actually, I found that some rich people behaved terribly, some behaved wonderfully, and same in third class or second class. There was this reaction. But I think the thing that grabs us about this disaster is, what will we do when faced with these life and death situations? How we want people to remember us? What would we do for our families? That was like the big motivator within that compressed 2.5 hour time period.
When I watch those men stand back from getting in the not full lifeboats, which of course is one of the hindsight 2020 realizations that, now they don't do women and children first because those boats weren't full. They could have saved far more people if they had just allowed who was there to get on. Maybe the women a little bit first, but at least then start filling it with other people. But it still is quietly horrific in watching the film. And I just recently rewatched Night to Remember, watching the men stand back and their faces and their wives' faces, not really quite understanding in that moment that this was the last of it. This was really goodbye, because nobody really says goodbye, do they? Because they can't quite face the horror of it.
No, I have to say that I rewatched the movie recently, and there's that scene where that first class family leaves their cabin, and you see the unspoken dialogue between the husband and the wife, in which the wife says, do we really have to wake the children up? Is it really necessary? And the husband said, yes, I believe we should do what the captain says. You can tell the woman is thinking, I know this is not good, but she does not panic. And they realize they have this unspoken communication that, like, what matters is we get the children off. And I have to say, as a father of 2 boys, of 3 and 6, and watching that scene again, as a father, I'm like, how would I react? Would my wife and I have that same tacit communication where I say, don't panic, look after your mother, say goodbye, but you don't want the kids to panic, but you need to get the kids off first. That's what you're thinking, that survival thing.
We get the moment in James Cameron's Titanic when Rose says, mother, the ship is going to sink and there aren't enough boats. Half
in the boat.
The ship are going to die, not the better half, which is a little sort of moustache twiddling from Cal. But it's half the people on the ship are going to die. She knew because it had been communicated to her via Thomas Andrews, and so
she did the math.
She did the math.
As a gentleman, I consider myself a gentleman, but as neither a woman nor a child, I tell you, I would not be standing back. I would be getting in a boat in some way. You can call me a modern-day Ismay, but I don't know about that.
It was a different time.
Yes, it is absolutely. Gentlemen are of a different ilk. Stephen, do you consider Ismay to be the villain that history has painted him as?
I think that what he did was extremely stupid. I think that he probably panicked. I think he should have thought that other men aren't doing it. Other men are not getting into the lifeboat. And he just did it while John Jacob Astor, Isador Straus, and other people of his class did stay back. I think what he did was extremely foolish, especially since the designer, Thomas Andrews, and the captain were staying on the ship. I think he acted in a moment of panic. I think that he was ultimately foolish. And he paid that price for the rest of his life, as we all know. But I think that the contrast to him is Colonel Archibald Gracie, another first-class passenger who, like Ismay, helped women and children get into the lifeboats. But what struck Gracie at the very end, when he was like, we're going to make a run for it with his friend Clinch Smith, he saw all these women and children, all of a sudden, the last men who had been kept down below, escaping on the deck, or suddenly showing up, coming out of the first class entrance. And he said, and he wrote in his memoir, that the agony of seeing this, that we had not done our job, that in fact there were lots of women and children trapped below and who'd come out at the last minute. And I think the ultimately damning statistic is that more first class men survive than first class children, and that alone should be something that should be in the scales against Ismay, since they were in his care, they're in his company's care. And and I'm saying this once again as biased as a parent, but like when you think of that statistic, that is inexcusable.
It's the ultimate form of denial as well. Imagine all the hubris that came up until that point, get the engines going, get into New York, let's break some records, let's be that ship that does that for the first time, but to then shift gears within an hour of hitting the iceberg, that no, all of that is gone, all of that. So that again, there's this, we know a lot more about sort of the psychology of when you're in a traumatic situation, how it's slightly surreal. You don't really know that you're experiencing it until afterwards. And a parent like yourself would have experienced it in that way. And Ismay is thinking about all the money and all the he's already just, what a disaster.
Well, money, exactly. And it's the business of steerage, like ferrying immigrants to America was huge business. This was, and I wrote down a fact that you said steerage was only at 70% capacity, and for a lot of these ships, it was the steerage business that facilitated the luxury that the first class passengers were enjoying. Like there wouldn't have been the luxury vacation for the first class had it not been for the business of steerage. And if you can speak to that. And I'm also reading that you mentioned there were only 50 Jews. I mean, your book talks about this second Exodus that as you call it, but there were only 50 Jews. So I'd like to talk about the business of steerage, and also, anti-Semitism is back in the news today, sadly. Would the first class Jewish passengers like the Strauses and Guggenheim have faced anti-Semitism, or was first class kind of beyond that?
I think on the Titanic, they did not face anti-Semitism. I think they were treated as paying customers. I think in third class did have a small kosher kitchen that was about the size of a closet. There was a kosher chef named Charles Kettle from Southampton. The kosher kitchen was inspected by the rabbi of Southampton at every voyage on the White Star ships. And the Titanic actually was kind of an odd ship when it came to the business model, because the Hamburg America Line ships, on the other hand, they sell directly out of Hamburg, maybe calling in Southampton or something briefly. But because they were closest to the greatest exodus of people leaving Eastern Europe, leaving the Russian Empire. So comparably sized Hamburg America Line ships would have 2,500 in third class and steerage. Titanic only had capacity for 1,000. So the Hamburg America Line ships were actually much more profitable in many ways. The Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic, they only called at Cherbourg, France, and at Queenstown, Ireland. Now, that's kind of far away from where most of European mass immigration is happening. So White Star was kind of at a competitive disadvantage in that market. But yes, steerage was a very lucrative business. You charged the equivalent of $1,100 a head, very low, very high margin. You don't provide, quote unquote, super high quality food or whatnot. Although the Titanic, her steerage or third class did have much better food and accommodations that were in the past. You had separate cabins for families or whatnot. That was an innovation actually borrowed from the Hamburg America Line, which Albert Ballin pioneered. Separate cabins for families, some waiter service in the dining room if you paid a bit more money, kosher food in the dining halls. So it was actually, in many ways, the White Star Line was borrowing what the German lines were doing, as well as the idea of the ships being outstanding floating hotels. That was a German invention, not a British one.
And Frances Fisher even said in James Cameron's film, she says it to Jack Dawson about, I hear the third class accommodations are quite good on this ship. So steerage passengers would have enjoyed probably better accommodations than they would have on other lines. I did not know until I read your book that Bruce Ismay was a second generation shipping magnate. I hadn't realized that he was the second Ismay. What do we know about the Ismay family dynasty prior him being born into the business?
Yeah, well, this is very common in the shipping business, whether in the age of sail or in this era of steam. It happened among British families. It happened among the Hamburg elite shipping families who I write about in other sections of my book. I mean, Ismay's father was Thomas Ismay, who was your classic bootstrapping, hard-knuckle businessman. He basically bought the bankrupt White Star Line in the 1860s for nothing, for £1,000, and he partnered with a gentleman named Gustav Christian Schwabe, who was actually a converted Jew from Hamburg, and they partnered together to both build the White Star Line and the Harland Wolff shipping line. So this was a symbiotic business. So, and also Schwab's nephew was named Wolff, and that was the Wolff of Harland and Wolff. So actually, Harland and Wolff actually has a German-Jewish connection, as does the White Star Line. But Ismay built this company from the ground up, and he introduced great luxury and first class. But his ships were also big steerage carriers, and he was absolutely a ruthless man. I think he was very tough on his son, Bruce. Bruce went to Harrow School, which is the same school that Winston Churchill went to. But instead of going on to college, I think Ismay was a sort of classic guy. I was like, you want to go to college and skylark your time away? No, you're going to come work for me. You're going to learn the real, you're not going to be some spoiled brat. You're going to come work for me right away. So I think the two of them had a kind of tough relationship. But I think Bruce Ismay, he was no idiot. I think he learned hard lessons from his dad on how to run a company. So, and it was he that sold the company after his father's death to JP Morgan's firm for a handsome $32 million. So the White Star Line was actually the only real moneymaker in JP Morgan's IMM portfolio. So there's this myth that, oh, JP Morgan just wrote the checks for the Titanic and her two sisters. No, it came from the cash flow of the White Star Line.
And JP Morgan got off pretty lucky in the fact that he was not on board that ship.
Yes, he canceled the last minute, supposedly to spend some more time with his mistress in France. But he, I think, if I remember correctly, he was supposed to occupy one of the big B deck suites, but then J. Bruce Ismay took that suite instead.
He was a taker, that Bruce Ismay. That's right. You mentioned your initial fascination with Titanic was because of the Strauses and the story your grandmother told you. How does your fascination with all things Titanic or maybe all things shipping, Oceanliner, how does that manifest itself? Have you been to the museum in Belfast? Did you go visit the Queen Mary in Long Beach? I mean, how do you recreationally satisfy those desires and interests?
Well, we've been lucky to go on. I've spoken on a couple of cruises for Seabourn Cruise Line, one of which was a transatlantic that went all the way up to Greenland. That was quite amazing. We as a family stayed a night in the Queen Mary a few years ago before COVID. I've a couple of pictures of my eldest son running at full speed along the promenade deck. And yeah, it's funny, as a maritime author, I've received countless models of clipper ships and of the SS United States, and I have to turn them down because there's only so many models you can have of a ship in your house before it gets a little out of control. But I will say that I do have behind me, when we visited Hamburg when I was doing research in 2019, I picked up a little model from the Hamburg Maritime Museum of the SS Vaterland, which was built in 1914 as the biggest ship in the world by the Hamburg America Line. And that was pretty amazing to go to Hamburg and see where so much maritime history happened too. I mean, this was a race, not just White Star was not just building to race to outdo Cunard. Their real rival were the Germans, and Albert Ballin. The Germans were building bigger and truly spectacular ships. They also made a ton of money.
Are you a mariner yourself? Are you a sailor? Do you have a boat? Do you get out there on the water?
I do not have a boat. I usually use other people's boats. I've been on in 2013. I went on a 7-day sailing trip to the Bahamas with 2 friends, and we managed to outrun a water spout, which was interesting. But I could knock around into sunfish. But the only boats that we actually own are 2 inflatable boats that we've used on the Brandywine Creek occasionally. But yeah, I've also been sailing, and a few years ago I went sailing in the San Francisco Bay, which was quite incredible, on a friend's boat, and I was given the tiller, and it's basically one of those things of do what the captain says. And we were heeling over pretty far, and I had my legs dangling out over the choppy waters of San Francisco Bay underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. But that's just one of those moments where you just think, okay, just hang on and do as you're told.
Cruises as a holiday. So when you go and you speak on those, I don't know. Like I get very overwhelmed when I'm on a cruise ship, and I have such a rich fantasy life. Are there places on your bucket list? Alexandra and I talk a lot about the Titanic Trail in Cove, Ireland. Now that's renamed Cove. But I got to visit there and have a tour. Dr. Michael Martin is a very gracious host. He created the Titanic Trail. I would put that on any Titanic enthusiast's bucket list. Do you have a maritime bucket list?
Well, I would like to do the transatlantic on the Queen Mary too. That would be quite wonderful. Everyone I've spoken to says that's a very authentic experience. And the ship is getting up there. 20 years is not young for a ship. I would love to do that. I've never been to Belfast. I would love to visit the Belfast Titanic Museum. But it's funny. My eldest son is interested in African animals, especially warthogs. He's interested in trolleys and trains. But now he's discovered the Titanic, and now he's very interested in that. So
another one, another
Start him
one.
young.
I do have to say, as a parent, you have to be very. He read about it in the Magic Tree House, and as a parent, you sort of have to. You have to answer very difficult questions about, like, this is not just some ship striking an iceberg. These are people here, and how do you explain to a child like the difficult stories that often go with history? It's like, how do you explain the Titanic? How do you explain the Holocaust?
But that's very common. We've done episodes on this about the appeal of the Titanic story to young people and how it draws children in from an early age. I mean, present company included in that. And yeah, there are difficult conversations to be had, but that's history for you. And there were a couple of things that as I pride myself on my own Titanic knowledge, that I was not aware of. Now, the opening scene of Night to Remember, the film, it starts with their christening Titanic with the champagne bottle. And I found out in your book that was not the case, that there was actually not a lot of fanfare when Titanic was launched and released. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder what the tradition came from, why they never did that. I remember reading somewhere there was some speculation that because Harlan Wolff was originally Jewish ownership, they didn't do that. I don't know whether it was superstition, but it was as one builder, Harlan Wolff said, they just builds them and shoves them in. And I don't know what the logic was. I mean, J.P. Morgan was at the launch, as was J. Bruce Ismay, and tens of thousands of people from Belfast came to watch this. And I think that one thing that we have to remember from back then versus now is that people took such pride of ownership who built this ship. I mean, this was something that they didn't just create, as one historian said, this was not just some assembly line that was cranking out Liberty ships. Like, this was a 3.5-year long project. And when the ship went down, the builders wept. I mean, they didn't lose anyone. Well, actually they did. They lost some members of the guarantee group, but their families weren't on the ship, but they wept. And I think, honestly, looking at today's culture where things are so disposable, I think there was that pride of, like, we built this, I built this. And It was built to last 30 years.
The entire city worked on Titanic. You know, they were riveters, or they were carpenters, or upholsterers, or whatever it was. So, you know, and for a long time, it wasn't just a factory punching out 10 Titanics a year or something. And we've learned on our conversations is that Belfast didn't want to talk about Titanic for many years. It was a source of shame that ship had not survived, and always sort of came back to Belfast until they built the museum, when they were discussing, do we really need a museum commemorating this dreadful part of our city's history? And now it is the city. People go to Belfast because they are excited to learn more about that ship and stand in the slipway and walk onto the Nomad, and it's kind of turned around. But at the beginning, or for many decades, they were not fessing up to it or not leaning into it.
No, it's trauma. I think it's like a lot of things. It's something that, you know, I mean, imagine, I guess the closest analogy would be, I mean, it's not, Titanic is no Chartres Cathedral, but still I think it's comparable in terms of the city comes together to build a cathedral, and it took, you know, it takes 100 years to build a cathedral, so it's not nowhere close to the Titanic, but still there's that feeling of like you build it and then it's there for everyone to see. It's there and willed into reality, something that we don't understand in our digital age. So yeah, I can understand that.
The irony is the Titanic's tragedy is the reason why it's still a topic of conversation. If it had arrived safely in New York, we wouldn't be talking about it today.
No.
It wouldn't
have been just another big White Star Line.
Now, you mentioned, and you'll correct my pronunciation if it's Mackay or McKay, the Mackay Bennett. You mentioned that it was there not just to retrieve the dead bodies. Why did they, you know, it wasn't just a recovery mission. Tell us about that, please.
Sure. I mean, this is one of the really, in talk about trauma, this was a cable ship that was rented by the White Star Line to retrieve bodies from the wreck site. And she arrived about a week after the ship went down. And this was done for two reasons. It was done because there were very wealthy passengers who perished, and the families wanted to reclaim the bodies. And I think the other kind of creepier reason is that the steamship companies didn't want all these dead corpses floating in the ocean because it was the North Atlantic Seaway, and there were ships coming and going, and the last thing that people wanted to see was dead bodies floating in the water. So they were, you know, the crew was overwhelmed by the number of bodies. They only got 300 or so. But I think the really sad thing that happened is that, like, they basically differentiated the corpses based on class. And they thought, oh, we can tell who's a first class, who's second class, who's third in crew. And basically, you know, people like Isador Straus, John Jacob Astor, they were recovered. Ida Straus, sadly, was never recovered. But they said, and they would identify them by, you know, if they got their wallet or something. But even after death, first class passengers were put in coffins and embalmed. Second class passengers were put in ice. And those thought to be crew or steerage were buried at sea, thrown overboard. And it's really sad. There was one Jewish passenger named Galinsky who was found, and he was buried at sea. And the irony was he was a Russian Jew who had spent some time in England. He was sent over by his family to establish a family beachhead in Chicago. He was a locksmith. They found his body. He was in his 30s. And, you know, they threw him overboard, and oddly enough, gave him a Anglican burial service. And then they also found the body of another immigrant named Sinai Kantor, who was traveling second class. He and his wife had saved some money, and they had, in the hold, several trunks of Russian furs, which they intended to sell to finance their dentistry studies. Miriam Cantor survived the disaster. Some friends took up a collection from the American Red Cross, and she was able to go to dentistry school. Sinai's body was found, and on his body was a silver watch that had a image of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments on one side and watch face in Hebrew characters in another, and that was recovered. And oddly enough, recently sold. But that
I saw
was
that on
for
Simon
a lot of money.
Midhurst's Instagram page. I saw that watch that was recently sold. I mean, what is your opinion about in terms of like bringing up artifacts from the ship? I mean, there are pros and cons to this. Do you have an opinion about that?
I mean, what's done is done. I mean, it's already been. I kind of go with Eva Hart's idea that it's a gravesite and it should be left alone. And by the way, Eva Hart, she was, one of the most famous survivors. She had a Christian mother and a Jewish father, and they, I think, they were traveling to immigrate to America, and she was British originally, but she said it's like this is a gravesite. This is you don't, or as Robert Ballard said, it's like taking belt buckles from the Arizona. There's something kind of macabre about it, but unfortunately, what's done is done. You can't undo what's been salvaged. So at this point, in principle, I'm against it, but it's too late now.
So interesting. And you talk about the funerals and the disposition of the victims, and I was rewatching, I don't remember, I was rewatching, it was either A Night to Remember or the Barbara Stanwyck Titanic version, and there were the Strauses singing Nearer My God to Thee, and I thought they probably wouldn't know the lyrics to Nearer My God to Thee.
No, I don't think they would have done that. I think they were pretty observant Jews, so they wouldn't have done that. So.
But their memorial service, you write, was at Carnegie Hall and attended by over 6,000 people. I mean, the public mourned the Strauses. There were dignitaries. There were just average New Yorkers. They were really mourned. And you have to wonder, other than Brangelina, who do we have in today's society that would be so loved? And we, of course, have the Straus Memorial on the Upper West Side. Let's finish the conversation where we began it. Your love for Titanic came out of the Straus story. What's the Straus's legacy?
I mean, the Straus's legacy, they're immensely philanthropic. They, like a lot of Jewish immigrants, they came in an earlier wave with the German Jews in the 1840s and 50s. It's interesting, Isador Straus initially spent time in Georgia, so kind of like the Lehman Brothers, he had some dabblings with the Confederacy, but then he moved up to New York and opened a crockery department in Macy's department store. Then eventually he and his brother bought the whole thing out. And they were extremely generous in philanthropy to Jewish causes. They were respected by both Jews and Gentiles in high society. They kind of bridged the gap. They're members of Temple Emmanuel. They're very close friends with the banker Jacob Henry Schiff. And they were just known to be very kind, very considerate, thoughtful people. I mean, the fact that Andrew Carnegie was extremely close with them and gave one of the eulogies, and members of the Jewish and Gentile elite were there at their funerals, and there were poor Jews standing outside Carnegie Hall in the rain. It's an immensely moving story that she could have saved her life, but she said it was not worth living her life without Isador. And the public responded to that. They still do respond to that. And that memorial on the Upper West Side, near the former side of their house, is one of the most beautiful pieces of sculpture in New York. And I think that is an example, the Strauses, of noble behavior in the face of tragedy. There was a lot of bad behavior that night, but that was a shining light in a very dark few hours.
Let's end it with that. Stephen, we're so grateful to you. We highly recommend the book, The Last Ships from Hamburg, and your other books, which I'm excited to read as well. You are now a treasured member of the Titanic Talk family. We're so grateful.
I learned so much. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this, hit the subscribe button. For information on where you can see Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, go to shipofdreamsfilm.com. Titanic Talk is a production of Ship of Dreams Film Limited. To celebrate Season 2 of Titanic Talk, we've launched a line of Titanic Talk merch. A cap, a mug, a tote, a t-shirt or a hoodie. You'll be sure to find a unique gift for the Titaniac in your life. Look for the link in the notes and on Instagram, or go to bit.ly/Titanic Talk Shop. And Nelson has a new book out. Dancing Between the Raindrops is a steamy page-turner full of all the tales Nelson can still remember from New York City in the 1980s. It's a coming-of-age story about friends in the era of big hair, padded shoulders, and punk rock. Dancing Between the Raindrops is available on Amazon or ask for it at your local bookstore.